WEAll Australia, and I'm here with other co-conveners today. Can you just maybe raise a hand and give a wave? If you are a co-convener, we have Di Bowles, we have Sol Crosswell, Georgina, Esther, Meg. It's a lovely team of people here who volunteer their time to help bring together this alliance in Australia. I just want to start also by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Gubbi Gubbi country, which is on the beautiful Sunshine Coast of Queensland, and pay my respects to elders, past and present, and really extend that to all of the elders and all of the lands and that we are joining from around the country and maybe beyond today. Please feel free to share that in the chat. Where are you coming from? What's your name? Introduce yourself. What field or sector are you in? Anything you want to say about what kind of brings you here today? This is really in part about fostering community and connection. So if we go to the next slide, introducing WEAll Australia, you're here because you're interested in creating a well-being economy. And specifically grounding that in Australia. But it's important to say that this is actually part of a really big global movement, and WEAll Global. And you can go to, if we can pop a link to the website in the chat as well. That would be great for anyone who doesn't know the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and wants to go dig around and check it out. If you're not already on the WEAll Australia mailing list, maybe you just saw this on social media or something, please join in. So it's part of a global movement, WEAll Global, and there are WEAll government partnerships. There's WeGov groups of WEAll Wellbeing Government Alliances of policymakers and people pursuing this from kind of a government lens. Around the world, there are also many WEAll member hubs. So that's the terminology, that's the lingo. We're a member hub here based in Australia. Yes, I know I have an American accent. I'm very sorry. There's nothing I can do about it. I've lived here longer than I've lived there, but it's where you grow up, right? So the purpose of our hub member calls is to continue really connecting people across the country to each other, to share, to kind of build the knowledge, the networks, the pathways, and to really have that inspiration and being proactive about, the spaces that we're in and working together to create a well-being economy, both collectively and then in the different sectors and spaces that you are in. So the WEAll Australia vision is an Australia that is fair, ecologically healthy, and served by an economy that supports the well-being of all, which, sounds pretty good. You can check out on the website. If you go to the WEAll Australia link, you can also check out our charter. So really, I invite people here. The way it's going to work today is we're going to have a Q&A style conversation. This is the agenda. With Professor John Quiggin from the University of Queensland, who I will introduce you to properly in just a moment. And please feel free to pop in your chats. Hello, Catherine. Lovely to have you here. Please feel free to pop in your questions into the chat really anytime, and or to raise your hand, however you would prefer, as I'll kick us off with some of the Q&A, but we would really love to hear from everyone. What are you grappling with? I mean, I can imagine that in the aftershocks of the US election, we're all grappling with some big questions, right? And particularly the role of the economy in that and the lessons for people here and elsewhere around the world who want to see us move in a direction of fairness and not just the system's broken. So, let's just torch it all and go on. So let me get to, yes, so please share your questions in the chat or put your hand up when the time comes if you would like to ask a question. So now I would like to really introduce our very special guest. Many of you know him or know his work. He is a very prolific writer, I believe. John, this might not be out of date now. At last I looked, you had 1,500 or so more publications to your name, including 6 books. I don't know if you had time to do any more since then.
Quite a few more books, and this since then, yeah, no, that's all.
Okay, right. That's out of date. Is your most recent book Economics in 2 Lessons: Why Markets Work So Well and Why They Can Fail So Badly? Is that still correct?
That's the most recent substantive one.
Hey, okay, good. Well, that's good. So Professor Quiggin, you're a professor of economics at the University of Queensland, a VC fellow in economics at the University of Queensland, and someone whose commentary and steers on this stuff I really trust and really listen to. Really grateful to have the next better part of an hour for your time and for some of the questions from our community here today. We can probably, yeah, I was going to say we probably don't need to screen share. We can probably just see each other, which is always nice. Please feel free to have camera on if you want, but totally understand people are getting lunch and doing a bunch of different things. So as we kind of kick off, I wanted to start by asking you, particularly in the aftermath of the US election, it I keep hearing, I grew up in America in the 80s and 90s, and under the Bill Clinton, mantra of it's the economy, stupid. It's the economy, it's the economy, and it's the economy. And, there's a lot of postmortems, there's a lot of debriefs and analysis happening right now about why did the Democrats lose? But they're not the only ones. They're not the only incumbents to have lost elections recently, right? Like we saw it in the UK at a state and territory level. We've seen it here in Australia this year. Can the role of the economy, and particularly the soaring cost of living, be overestimated in these results? Is in your opinion that really where this is coming from?
Well, thanks, Lily. I'd also like to acknowledge I'm speaking from cubby country, so somewhere in the same general part of the world as you, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Yeah, I think the first fact is that most prices went up quite a bit in the aftermath of the recession. Now, the cost of living is a natural way of framing those things, but generally speaking, a misleading one that we need to avoid. So those prices have gone up. Incomes in total have gone up. They've gone up faster than inflation for some people, significantly less than inflation for most wage earners. Now, so really, and the response of that from central banks, the Reserve Bank of Australia, in increasing interest rates, further reduces the disposable income of some people while increasing that of others. So what really matters is in fact the purchasing power of disposable income. And that's also been affected by tax changes under the current government, most of which implemented the policies followed by the previous government, which have in general increased tax burdens on people on lower middle incomes. So I think it's very difficult to get past that. What we see, I think, is what's called money illusion. That is, if my wages go up and my prices go up 10%, I say, well, that's great. I'm a really great worker, and my bosses recognise this by giving me a big wage rise. But unfortunately, the government has screwed up, and there's this inflation going on, which is really terrible. So that's, I think, a very hard framing to combat, but it's nonetheless, we should be aware in all we're doing that it isn't the correct way to think about things. That the cost of living, the purchase of any given consumer bundle is 10, 20, 30 times what it was 100 years ago. That doesn't mean people were better off back then because their wages were correspondingly even lower. The other problem, I think, is a political one, which is that in many ways, in the Australian context, the crucial thing was the defeat of the Voice referendum. In my view, just reflecting the fact that Australians usually vote no in referendums. The slogan for the opposing side didn't raise any particular points. It just said, if you don't know, vote no. And that is essentially a winner in any referendum. But the government has chosen to take that as a rebuke to them for not being laser focused on the cost of living, and therefore a reason for doing nothing. So, so my analysis really is, this has been a mistake. I suppose my only reaction in this context, the US election, is, well, a government that's doing nothing whatsoever except pontificating the cost of living is probably not the worst government we could have in the as things are going. But I think what we see is just a mistaken analysis that then leads to policies which fiddle with individual prices. Occasionally we get something good. In Queensland, we got 50-cent public transport, which was a great idea, but most of the time it's just whatever number happens to be appearing in the focus groups and so forth. So it's a very misleading way of thinking about things, and one which is hard to campaign against, but certainly is one we shouldn't allow to drive our own thinking about what's going on, which is that income is being redistributed, and the process of this redistribution mostly was away from wage earners and away from people who are either renting houses or paying off mortgages, and towards non-wage earners, which include both recipients of capital income, but also lots of retired people who are receiving small amounts of capital income, to people who own their own homes outright, and so forth. So that's, I guess, a starting point on why we should always be suspicious when we hear anybody talking about the cost of living. It may be just the natural way that people tend to think about things, or it may be a clearly wrong political analysis. So I'll maybe stop there and just see if anybody has any questions and comments at that point.
Great. And while you do, I'll try to make sure I'm going to try to recap and you tell me if I've got this right. So it's not that we have a cost of living crisis, it's that wages, labor, has not been getting its fair share.
Yeah.
And so wealth from capital is going up faster than wealth from wages.
Yeah.
And within that, governments have been either making things worse
Yeah.
through tax policies, et cetera, that further kind of
Yeah.
preference capital over maybe labor, or capital or wealth accumulation through capital versus wealth accumulation through wages. Is it fair to say that we haven't? I mean, there's been real from the, long tail of COVID, the war in Ukraine. My understanding is there have been real, constraints that have led to some of these inflationary pressures. I guess that what I hear reflected in the kind of popular debate around this is then corporations kind of just piled on and went,
Yeah.
woohoo, like we can
Yeah.
hike profits in this context because everyone thinks
Yeah.
inflation's just happening anyway. So has it actually been a sort of crisis of inflation, or just a crisis of like corporate greed making inflation
Sure.
much worse than it should have been?
Well, first thing I suppose one point I should have made in my original thing is a crucial point about this perspective is when you think about the cost of living and say we should have a wage increase, people will say, well, that's inflation, we'll make the cost of
Yeah.
living worse. So that's the crucial problem. I don't really like the corporate greed framing because, I mean, corporations were greedy before COVID.
Yeah.
It's what's happened, and I think the crucial thing isn't so much the supply chain constraints, although they played a role during the lockdown years, since the pandemic
Mhm.
is still with us.
Mhm.
Really, it's that to get us through the pandemic, governments gave lots of people lots of money, and at the same time there were very few opportunities to spend it. And so that money, that it's really that demand side process, in my view. This is not what everybody else thinks, but
Mhm.
and that increase in demand makes it possible for corporations to increase their profit margins. And so that's, in my view, broadly speaking, what's happened, combined with the fact that the way our labour market is structured, there are these very inherent restrictions on on increasing wages, which have been added to by this kind of cost of living framing.
So if this is a global phenomenon, what can we actually do about it at a more local or national level? I mean, you talked about the Queensland example, and yes, we had 50-cent fares. That policy is so popular that even
Yep.
as conservatives have won, they've kept it. We also had $1,000 off our electricity bills, which she
Yep.
told us was because it was in state-owned hands.
Yep. I think
But it
actually,
seems to me governments don't want to necessarily come out and say, you know what, we're actually impotent to do much about this without challenging the foundations of the kind of what we would call the neoliberal paradigm,
well,
which is a conversation they probably don't want to try to have with punters.
well, I mean, inflation's pretty much in the past. It's happened. Um, yeah, people are, yeah, people are maybe still a bit annoyed about the fact that something cost more than it did 5 years ago, but I mean, prices have been rising slowly for a long time. So I think in that sense, that particular problem is largely past. And it's just a matter, I guess, of pushing back. I think uh, although that played a role, played a role in recent elections, the point I would make is, which is a very depressing one for Americans, not quite so much for Australians, is 3 times in a row, 50% of people have voted for Trump. They voted for Trump at the beginning, they voted for Trump at 4-year intervals with radically different economic conditions. And that says something very bad about US society. The same kind of forces in general in Australia have failed. Pauline Hanson poured 30% 20 odd years ago. We've had a string of little panics, with the exception really of the treatment of refugees, and of course with that's one where we've clearly lost. With the reconciliation process on the whole, and despite the mess up, I view the voice referendum not as a rejection of that, just as a screw up on the part of the people who gave us the referendum, that it was just a really dumb idea to have a referendum without putting legislation in place first, and was bound to lose. I don't see, for example, when the no side switched from saying just vote no because you don't know to saying we've won this one, now we're going to stop welcome to country and so forth. Well, that's in the rear vision mirror, and there hasn't been any move away from welcome to country that I've seen. So I mean, rapidly, but I think the problems of migration, race, culture, and so forth are big ones, but much less so in Australia than they have been in the US, and almost anywhere else. I mean, we're seeing, of course, the same forces emerging in lots of places, but we have beaten them in the past, and I hope we'll be able to do so in the future.
All right, that's so interesting. Well, I'd like to really invite everyone now. If anyone has a question, they want to put their hand up. We really want to make this a kind of free and open Q&A space. And I mean, I can keep going while people get brave, and share their thoughts or questions for John. I'm curious, what would be your advice? Just while the questions start to come in, I've got one more for you. What would be your advice to a and we're not a partisan, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is not necessarily, on a mission to get Labor re-elected for the sake of it. We're not connected to any political party. But for any incumbent government right now, and particularly through a bit of a wellbeing economy lens, if we're trying to make the economy work better, serve better for people, if you could give advice to
Sure.
Chalmers, what would that
Well, I
look
mean,
like?
I gave some unsolicited advice to the current government. I responded, I guess, to the presidential election by saying I'm not going to talk about that stuff whatsoever. But also, so I think and I think there's a question here about tax policy, and the answer, unfortunately, I think is, in most respects, there's not, we're locked in by the decisions the government's already taken, that not much is going to happen on that front. But I think, taking the 50-cent bus fare as an example, this is something that's was right outside the so-called Overton window. I mean, the Greens were saying it, but you'd expect the Greens to say it. Labor picked it up and did it, and so popular that, as you mentioned, the LMPs had to do it. To my mind, a lot of the potential progress for wellbeing is in work-life balance. And to be fair, it's one of the few areas where the current government has been pretty good. It's supported unions in particular, but also things like right to disconnect. And my suggestion of a policy similar to the 50-cent bus fares is to move to a 4.5-day week, knocking off on Friday afternoon. We can do it. I think I've been long a supporter of the 4-day week, but that's a big deal off in the future. I think the government could do this right now and say, here's this benefit that it's long overdue, long time since we had a reduction from 40 hours to 38. And furthermore, because for very large classes of office workers, Friday is an at-home day, and Friday afternoon is already a wind down time. This is true around the world. This would be a piece of economic justice for people who don't benefit from work from home. That they haven't got any benefit from this, whereas for everybody who has, it's this huge. All the estimates say it's something like a 10% wage increase, or you need a 10% wage reduction to take it off. That's essentially what we've lost through the inflation, but large classes of workers got nothing from this, and so they'd be the ones who would actually get time off, proper time off, when they could go home and get ready for the weekend. Whereas for those of us who work, used to work in offices and now spend Friday afternoon in front of the computer, it just means, well, we can slack off with a clear conscience because um, it's now right. Yeah, we're time. It essentially just brings the time to disconnect a few hours earlier. In practice, I suspect lots of office workers would say, well, I've got a few files to deal with I've knocked these over.
Yeah.
So I think it would be a huge benefit for the workers who haven't benefited from work from home. It's affordable. Because I'd have almost no impact on the productivity of the office class of workers, and I think reductions in hours are always offset by increases in their per hour productivity. So that is my piece of gratuitous advice for the government. I mean, my more general piece is they have to do something because the idea that they're going to sit around, which Albanese seems to have held, that they're going to sit around in the back office letting things run smoothly and people reward him, I think has proved not to be true.
I think slack off with a clear conscience is my favorite political slogan ever, and it's a great idea. Warwick, you've had your hand up. What do you want to ask? And then we've got a couple of questions in the chat that I'll go to.
Hi, John. Yeah, I'm not as sorry, I've got a strange echo. That's it. Sorry, I've got a weird sound set up here. I'm not as optimistic as you about the sort of play in the US not being appealing here, and I think we're potentially already seeing Dutton start to talk a bit more Trump-like, and I think there's a reasonable amount of disaffection with the current economic situation, both because of real wages going backwards and housing. I think housing is a really massive issue at the moment, not only for people who can't afford to buy their own house, but the sort of parents of those people as well. So even people with housing, I think, recognise that there's a problem. And I think in that environment with a lot of disaffection, the sort of populist right-wing playbook is effective, and there isn't an equivalent progressive playbook. So I think the 4-day week is a I've long been a supporter of that myself. It's complex, of course, because of all the professions that can't do it, that have to be cross-subsidized. But we've done it before, so I agree with you. We should do it. But yeah, I guess just curious about that, about particularly the disaffection around housing and the sense that the future is potentially worse for the next generation than it was for the last. I think that's quite a common perception amongst young people. And that does open people up to right-wing populism, I think.
Well, guess my view is most of the time, the Greens have captured a lot of this territory. I mean, large portion of people are renting, and the two major parties have more or less interchangeable policies on how to encourage house buying, which they've had for a very long time. For historical reasons, Labor, the Liberals don't like superannuation and Labor does. So the Liberals say, let's take money out of super, but I just don't see those things having much impact. And then the other part of this policy that works well in a bunch of places is blaming migration, but I think that's a much harder sell in Australia. Unless it's fine if it's boat people. We can all say, we hate people coming here uninvited on boats. But if you say, for example, we should cut down on family reunion, you've instantly lost lots and lots of votes. If you try and pick on any particular ethnic group, which is very easy to do in Europe, US, and so forth, you're losing a big block of votes in a country where 30% of people were born overseas. So I don't really see Dutton pushing remarkably hard on this stuff. If you look at the broader anti-woke agenda, abortion's a central element of the US. A bunch of people on the right raised it, and the party leaders have slapped them down and said, we do not want to go back. We do not want to go back to these issues. We've lost, and that's the end of it. Just as I guess Labor has done on refugees.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I'm going to go to some of the questions in the chat now, and moderators do pull me up if it looks like there's any that I'm missing. But I just thought going in order, we'd start with Alistair McKenzie. How do we get much needed tax reform passed in our political landscape? Vested interests control the narrative and often the major parties.
Of course, we did have a bit of a win. with the stage 3 tax cuts were modified. So the issues there, I think the answer really, though, is, and sorry for being partisan, the thing to do is to break the grip of the major parties. That it's a long shot that an independent could win a place like Fairfax, where I'm living now, but they're going to try. And so I think the numbers are large enough that we could easily see, if things go well, we'd easily see minority governments becoming the way of the future, and that makes. Well, in particular, again, I'm sorry to keep on bagging out Mr. Albanese, but his view very clearly is what we need is for the two major parties to get together and agree on stuff. That's been the case with housing, with the housing bill they put up. The Greens will give him votes happily for a compromise. Obviously, the LNP isn't going to. If you look at Mr. Dutton's office door, it says Leader of the Opposition, and this is what they do. But Albanese continually thinks, look, if we go out, the other side will come in, and what we want is something that's something that will endure, and that's thinking, I think, which has ceased to be relevant. So I think if we got a minority Labor government, we might see some change. We're not going to see it certainly from this government.
That's so interesting. And I certainly know that that's the messaging that the Climate 200 community independents are kind of going out across the board. The two-party system is what's broken. Independence for how we fix it. We have a question here from Di Bowles about the Isabella Weber's work on shockflation and looking at price control. So Di, you might want to chime in and add some context to that. But my understanding is, should there be government price controls on essential items? Did you want to add anything to that, Di?
No, I just think there was an argument there that I thought was interesting, and I was just curious as to what you thought about price controls on some really basic products.
Yeah, I think that's the same misconception that's in the cost of living. What we need is higher wages and people spend their money on what they want.
So on that, better framing than the cost of living crisis is Saul's question. So how do we peel back the covers on some of those underlying structural issues? Should we be calling it a wealth redistribution crisis?
Well, certainly, certainly in the context, there are really two discussions going on here. And one is in some sense, and I'm using the term very broadly within the policy class, of which we're a sort of dissident part, the people who spend lots of time thinking about policy, know the names of people involved in the debate. And in that context, absolutely, we should be pushing back, as I say, pushing back on any framing to do with cost of living and making everything about income and wealth. Those are two closely related concepts. As I say, with the trying to get broader messaging out to the public, I suspect the answer is probably that this particular battle is really fading into the rearview mirror. Inflation is to it, really, in a year or two's time, people won't be thinking about inflation because prices are higher than they were at some point in the past, but that's always been true. So I think the kind of focus on things like well-being is the right way to go. And I think an important bigger picture part of this stuff is that what we're seeing is the breakdown of neoliberalism. So I said I wouldn't comment, but one thing Trump is absolutely not is a neoliberal in any way, shape, or form. It's a tariff protectionist, a crony capitalist, somebody who believes if you've got the power of the state behind you, use that power to direct the economy in the way you choose. And that's one version of the reaction against neoliberalism. And so in a sense, what we need is a positive alternative to that. I think the idea, if you look at the kind of policies people have talked about, no one any longer says, well, that will interfere with the market.
That's really interesting.
It's a long time since I've heard anybody. People can argue for and against, but no one is using free market type arguments anymore because no one believes it. And economists, I think, still probably having pushed hard against this stuff, I'm sort of saying, well, actually, as my book says, markets are actually really good in their place. But no, the idea that more markets are going to make things better, I think, is absolutely dead. And so what we need is a positive alternative. And in many ways, I think it's shifting the ground onto things like onto positive things like well-being, probably to some extent playing down the conflict framing that's implicit in welfare distribution. And in some sense, we have to do that stuff, but we should be pointing to positive stuff. And I think, if I could go back to the 2019 election, which was a real disaster, we had a bunch of stuff about how we were going to raise taxes to do stuff, but we never heard anything about what was going to be done. I remember straight after the election, Tanya Plibersek said, well, no one seemed to care about our free dental policy. And I thought, I must be in the top 1,000 political junkies in the country, and I didn't even know they had a free dental policy. There was one ad one day, and then you had to go to the website and look it up. Whereas I heard over and over again that Morrison was on the side of the big end of town, which I kind of knew before the election. So I think that's I think the answer, and clearly pointing that again, I'm just breaking my promise, but if there was one lesson from Trump, it's that pointing to the incredible negatives on the other side isn't enough. And I think, it was given enough time. I think the opportunity economy, that kind of stuff, might have turned things around a bit, but it's certainly clear that you need a much more of a positive view, that a positive promise, and I think well-being is the kind of way to talk about this, but particularly though making it concrete. I think the difficulty with it is no one's going to care about gross national happiness or any of that kind of stuff outside this room. What we need is, if you don't like the 4.5-day week, come up with something that says, we could be living better than we are.
So that's a great segue to Mark Spain's question about what would be some top 3 legislative changes that community committed MPs could be elected on and take to Parliament. So we know, again, with our current, the so-called TEAL, the community independents, they usually have a kind of similar view around climate change and the need to have a scientific approach to that. That plays differently in different electorates, but broadly the Australian population still polls wanting more climate action rather than less. We've talked about 4.5-day work weeks. You just mentioned dental. Would there be anything else that you would elevate as like, come on, guys, get behind me?
I think, certainly, there's a bunch of stuff you can do, and you don't, 3 said, Albanese had 3 things. There was, the Voice and the Corruption Commission and his horrible housing policy. So 3 is, those 3 is a good number. I think in a sense, it doesn't, it's not, bearing in mind we're talking about a fairly disparate movement where there's room for different people to push different things. I think climate has to be in there. Something about work and life has to be in there. And then something good that government should be doing for us and aren't. Those are the kinds of things we need to be talking about. And I don't think we necessarily need to have a unified message as to, in the second and third categories, what those things are. But that's the kind of, I think the kind of message we want is, I think just well-being isn't having community therapists or some such. I'm just, it needs to be something.
As Catherine Trebek, who's on the call, says, well-being isn't happiness. It's not about, frolicking through the fields, holding hands necessarily, although we're not against that.
I'm all in favour of that.
We're all in favour of daisies and rainbows, but that's not a policy.
But as I say, saying we have a 4.5-day week, and if you want to spend the Friday afternoon frolicking, that's fine. But if you want to spend it looking at the footy tips, that's also fine.
I know that this is a big question to throw at you in the last kind of few minutes, and we also have a question from Tarek that I'll come to shortly. But on housing, it's such a big issue. It comes up again and again as, housing, groceries, energy bills, right? Like the trifecta. But housing is such an issue of intergenerational equity, of this kind of growing class divide, this feeling of an underclass, of a generation that's not going to have the same standard of living as their parents. I'm a geriatric millennial. We scraped into the housing market by moving interstate to Queensland by the skin of our teeth. As an economist, do you think that there are some views that we should be pushing for?
Well, the big thing which economists they did have this, the conversation has this survey, and pretty much the top item is social housing, and that's governments getting in. I mean, I think, and I would actually go further and mostly say public housing, because I mean that, that if we want more housing and we want the government to do something about it, the obvious thing is for the government to build some houses.
So you would put that about capital gains tax, negative gearing.
Well, so those are financing. The first thing, those are financing things. I suppose the second thing is, I think, in a sense, we need to, for a bunch of reasons, we need to focus much less on making home buying accessible and much more on making housing accessible. And so that means we should be focused. It's very difficult to do I mean, capital gains taxes, but if we want something we should really be doing, which somebody I don't like very much, but it was right in this, is Peritet, we should be imposing land tax on owner-occupied housing. I mean, that's the radical measure, getting rid of stamp duty, and not putting any subsidies into home buying, but getting rid of stamp duty, and then using land tax on family homes on owner-occupied homes to apply that, and in the process of that, removing the threshold on land tax where everyone pays, or imposing it nationally. Land tax and social housing are what even the more neoliberally inclined of my economist colleagues would agree on this. So that's what we need to do. But I think the answer. I mean, the first observation to make is, I am past retirement age. I can't remember a time when governments weren't doing something or other to make it easy for home buyers, but they can't do anything for home buyers because the only thing that makes it easy is reducing the price of houses, and that hurts homeowners. So I think housing rather than home ownership is what we want there.
Yeah.
See, somebody mentioned the ACT. I mean, in that sense, it would be really great. And I actually had a whole attempt to do all this stuff of saying, is there some way the ACT did it precisely because they had, they're both a state and a government and a local council. So what they did essentially was just jack up the rates. I mean, that's the ideal way of doing a land tax, because rates are a land tax. So if you could I don't know how you would do the reorganisation. I did go into it, but that if you could reorganise things such that the rates became a statewide tax, some of which was then given back to fund councils, that will be the way that will be one route to this thing, which the ACT has had very successfully. I mean, they're most of the way there now. I think they've got rid of most of the remaining stamp duties. But also, of course, having a one-party progressive government for 20, 30 years probably also helps there.
Yeah. Thank you. That's so fascinating. All right, just before we come to kind of the next part of our member call here, 1 minute on global poverty elimination. We have a great question from Tarek about your idea of poverty elimination as a global public good. How could we persuade countries in the global north to fund basic income programs in the south? Seems like we can't convince them to fund basic income programs in the north, but I like the idea.
No, I mean, well, I suppose one way I haven't got much political insight. I mean, one thing that seems pretty obvious is that if things were better in very poor countries, people would be less desperate to leave them. You would think that would be one way of pushing this idea. I don't have one thing which I mean very clear in the US, but I think elsewhere is people are under the impression that we're already doing a lot, and the answer is we're doing nothing. US, after you take out strategic aid to Israel and then other countries that are near Israel and stuff like that, the US gave something like 3% of GDP to Europe in the years of the Marshall Plan, and maybe gives 0.03% in similar kinds of aid now. And so, but no, I mean, I think if I could work out a way of selling that idea, I would, yeah, think I'd run for president of the world or something, because it's just a very, it's obviously desirable, but I have no idea how we can persuade people to, other than sort of leaning on the conscience of at least progressively minded governments, which has some little effects.
Wonderful. And one final question here from Catherine Trebek, who is
Predistribution. Well, predistribution basically is wages. I mean, that's number one step in predistribution is higher wages. And so I suppose that's I think, the big thing we need to do right at this very moment is pushing back on the idea that increases in wages will raise inflation and therefore increase the cost of living. That's, I think, the biggest single push. I think then we have this sort of global problem of billionaires and so forth. I mean, one thing which has come out of this, I think, is very little belief in billionaires as benefactors of humankind, which back when billionaires were Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, and we didn't know any of the bad stuff about Bill Gates, seemed a much more plausible idea than it does now. So, but and I suppose, something very bureaucratic and grinding in this stuff is that for 20 odd years, the OECD, which isn't the most marvelous of organizations, has been grinding away at global tax avoidance to the point where we are seeing for the first time increases rather, or at least not an end to the long-running decrease in company tax rates, reflecting the fact that corporate tax profit shifting is no longer as easy as it was. And we have seen, I think, an end to the idea that at least moderately wealthy individuals can dodge taxes using tax havens and so forth. That has sort of largely gone out. So there are, though that's not, I suppose, really predistribution, but so I've gone off topic there. But certainly just the trying to I suppose, coming back, restoring public ownership of monopolies, because monopolies is the big source of profits is monopolies. That was Warren Buffett's great insight: buy a monopoly and you can just continue to cash the checks around.
Yeah, thank you. And great follow-up point there from Catherine too in the chat. So we're getting to the point where you've given us a lot to think about, and I want to actually give people an opportunity to go off into smaller groups. Maybe we'll have a couple of different breakout rooms, just for people to maybe unpack a little bit of this in relation to your work, what you're grappling with in particular, kind of any key takeaways. But before we do that, so that will be about 10 minutes just at the end, and if people need to drop off, we understand, that's fine, you can do that. I just wanted to throw the floor open to people for some very quick announcements about in kind of the wider well-being economy space. So Georgie, I think you had one about the purpose film.
Sorry, just running upstairs.
Put you on the spot when you're moving rooms.
Sorry. Yes, two things. So here in Perth, we have the premiere of the Purpose film. So Catherine's on the call, but it's about the story of WEAll. So that's happening on, I think it's, sorry, just pulling some things up quickly, on the 11th of December. So I'll throw the link in into the chat, and just in case there's anyone from Aotearoa New Zealand on the call, there's also the WEAll New Zealand contingent conference at the end of November. So I'll also put that in the chat too. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And then Di, you wanted to talk about the Intergenerational Summit?
Yeah, I was just going to let everyone know that on November 21st, so next week, is the Intergenerational Fairness Summit. And we've got a lineup of great speakers. So unfortunately, it's not live streamed, but I'm sure that some recordings will go up. And just know that this is a growing movement, the future generations, and some really nice announcements will come out of that summit. So stay tuned. And then Catherine's saying that the movies are premiering in Canberra on Wednesday, The Purpose, and Bigga Valley on the 18th of November, and Castlemaine on the 6th of December. So amazing. You can tell those communities are the ones that are always doing such great work, and they're first to get the movie out. So fantastic.
Can someone pop a link to the film in the chat just for people to go and check it out? This is, yeah. It's, but that is fantastic. And that the Intergenerational Summit is a nice segue into our January call, where we're actually going to be hearing from Tom Walker and Jane Bodie from Think Forward, who might be on today's call. I can't see everyone who is here right now in the chat. I can just see the little screens of half a dozen above. But yeah, we're going to be talking about, so Think Forward's a great organization. We'll pop a link to them in the chat as well, but they are committed to an economy that works well for all generations. And so we're going to be talking about how well-being economy can serve all generations. So if you're not on our email list, get on our email list, follow us on LinkedIn. We'll be sure to share those. I want to take a minute before people disperse into breakout rooms, and then we can come back at the end for just, one or two quick shares. Firstly, to thank you, John. Thank you for coming and sharing with us your wisdom and views and expertise. Also to say, if we have any other announcements from this community, from within the group, please do put it in the chat. Please share. That is part of what we are absolutely here to do. And then, yeah, let's go into some breakout rooms for just like 10 minutes, and then we'll just reconvene and we will close on time. So if someone who is driving this all, Meg, can you pop people into some breakout rooms? And then we'll come back.